And we're into session 2 of our conference. We're already beginning late, hopefully we'll finish in time. The good news is that we have only 2 speakers. As I moved to the earlier one. So session 2 was named Al-Ittihad in the 1950s. And we have 2 speakers. I assume Orit will be the first. Orit Bashkin is a professor of modern Middle East history, University of Chicago, at the Center of Middle Eastern Studies, University of Chicago. If I may add, a graduate of my alma mater, her alma mater, Tel Aviv University. Her research interests include Arab intellectual history, modern Iraqi history, the history of Arab Jews in Iraq and Israel, and well, she's here for many reasons. Number one, it's not the first time that she's a professor. I think the last time you were here was with Nina, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, her most recent book, widely acclaimed, is New Babylonians, a history of Jews in modern Iraq, which pertains directly to the topic of this conference. She published the Other Iraq Tourism, Intellectuals and Culture in Hashemite Iraq, 1941 to 1958, Culture and Culture in Egypt, Cultural Planning, National Identity and Social Change in Egypt, and she co-authored with Sarah Gershoni and Kuzma. Orit is very familiar with the one chapter in Sami Michael's biography pertains to the early 50s, his period in Al-Ittihad. And without further ado, Orit, I invite you to start and speak. I will quote you the title of your presentation, Sami Michael as Samir al-Marid, an Iraqi-Israeli communist.
A member of the Iraqi Communist Party evaluated the relationships between Iraq and its Jews thusly. The Iraqi government tries to conceal those truly responsible for the disaster of our Arab people in Palestine, Naqqash al-Arabi fi Palestine. That is, it wishes to conceal British colonialism. It treats the Arab Jews, al-Yahud al-Arab, who lived with Iraqis for generations without any confrontation, as if they are responsible for Zionism and takes revenge on them. This memo was not written after 1948, after the Nakba. It was written in 1945, before the conflict in Palestine assumed its bloodiest shapes. It was not written by a Jew, but rather by a Christian, the charismatic and powerful leader of the illegal Iraqi Communist Party, Yusuf Salman Yusuf, known as Fahad. Fahad himself will be executed by the Iraqi state as a part of a brutal campaign to eradicate Iraqi communists from the land. The Jewish community of Iraq will be forced out of Iraq, leaving behind a tradition lasting 2,500 years. But the Iraqi communist assumption that the Jews were loyal and patriotic Iraqis, and it is their role as communists to stand with the Jews against the attempts of the Iraqi state, and especially the Iraqi right, to mark Iraqi Jews as convenient scapegoats, appealed to many Jews. It also appealed to a young man who joined the ICP, the Iraqi Communist Party, circa 1943, Saleh Kamal Menashe Eliyahu. To Beni Tzipor, I will say that he's named Kamal in honor of Ataturk, who's with us today. A son of a middle-class family, upper middle-class family, which made the typical journey from the purely Jewish neighborhoods of the city to the upscale era of Batawin, and a product of the outstanding Jewish education system in Iraq, this man will play a major role in the women's and students' organizations of the Iraqi Communist Party until forced out of Iraq in 1948-9. We know this man as Sami Michael. In this short conversation, I would like to reflect on Sami Michael, the communist, in the years 1943-1955. As a historian, I will not deal with his literary work, but I hope to shed light on some of the elements within the socio-economic context which gave birth to Michael's communism and the communism of many members of his Jewish community. I would also like to highlight the fact, and this relates to the comments made by both Yigal and Ella, that his activity as a communist in Israel was shaped by his Iraqi politics. At first glance, this comparison makes little sense. In Iraq, the Jewish upper and middle classes enjoyed economic success, especially after 1941. In Israel, over 100,000 Jews were forced to live in horrendous poverty in transit camps, ma'abarot, during the 1950s. In Iraq, the community was a minority and suffered from anti-Semitism, where in Israel they were supposedly the majority living in the Jewish state. In Iraq, the upper and middle classes, or at least the intellectuals, were Arabized. They wrote in Arabic, they translated to and from Arabic. In Israel, the state pushed for the hegemony of Hebrew. Iraq, according to official discourse, was a constitutional monarchy. Israel, a socialist democracy. How then can we conceptualize continuities? Observing the writings and actions of Sami Michael and fellow Iraqi communists, we can point to a few features, however. The communists in Iraq and in Israel developed a healthy allergy to any form of ethnic nationalism. In Iraq, the communists, Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike despised the right-wing nationalism which sang the glory of the Arab races and chanted slogans of Arab unity, while their policy, in fact, was anti-democratic, exclusionary, and in many cases anti-Semitic. The communists, in contrast, were Iraqi patriots, and saw Iraq as the land of all its people, including a host of minority groups whose mother tongue was not Arabic: Kurds, Armenians, Assyrians, and so on. Iraq was a land built on a sectarian logic, in which hegemony was reserved to the Arab Sunni elites, despite the fact that the Shia population constituted the majority of the country. The country was established on an unholy alliance between tribal leaders, landowners, and the ruling elites, an unholy alliance that the communists despised. This country was also constructed on a careful policy of divide and conquer, which pitted one community against the other. The communists wanted a democratic nation for all. In Israel, communists like Sami Michael protested against Jewish ethnic nationalism, which discriminated against Israel's Arab citizens and against Jews from Middle Eastern countries. The attempt of the Israeli state to strengthen religiosity in order to fight the communists, to pit Christians against Muslims in the Palestinian sector, to create a social hierarchy in which non-Ashkenazi groups were relegated to the margins of society and kept away from the Arab population, looked only too familiar. And so actually the ideologies are much similar than we think. So let us begin in Iraq. It is no great secret that the Iraqi Communist Party assumed a major role in Iraqi politics since the early 1940s. Not unlike their counterparts in Europe, Iraqi Jews entered the ranks of their country's Communist Party because they believed in its vision of equality and social justice. The ICP, the Iraqi Communist Party anti-fascist stand, was indeed a major factor that convinced Jews to join its ranks. We have to remember here an event that is crucial to Sami Michael's writing, but also to his biography and the biography of many Jews, which is the Rashid Ali al-Gailani's coup, a pro-German, pro-Nazi coup in Iraq. The failure of the coup was marked by the brutal butchering of over 170 Jews in Iraq in a wave of urban riots known as the Farhud. And that influenced many Jews. As Sami Michael explained, the pogrom, the Farhud, the pro-Nazi government, and the blunt anti-Semitic propaganda hit us hard. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the heroic Soviet war against Nazi Germany was a much discussed topic in the Iraqi public sphere. A Zionist emissary complained, "When you enter a house of a Jewish merchant, you might find a son named Stalin. They, the Jewish merchants, say that England will not give us the land of Israel. The Germans will kill us, and hence Russia remains the only redeemer. When you ask a Jewish merchant like that, but they will take your money if a communist regime happens, he says, I'll get by. Michael was drawn to the universalism in communism. Communists brought us back to the world of the living. It honored us. The presence of Jews in the Soviet Party and the Red Army was a great sign of respect to the Jewish people in his view. And if you look at people that Sami Michael knew at the time, like Yusuf Harun Zilkha, Naim Tweg, and others, they actually write about the heroic struggle of communism against fascism and so on. More importantly, the communists marked Iraqi right-wing nationalists who were very much anti-Jewish as fascists, and they attacked them continuously in their press. The Communist Party not only promised to combat racism and anti-Semitism, it also delivered. Party demonstrations from 1945 onwards countered right-wing slogans such as "Death to the Jews" that were also seen in walls in 1941 with their own slogans, "Long live Judaism," "Long live Arab Jewish Brotherhood," which were seen in Baghdad and in Basra. The anti-imperialist position of the ICP also appealed to Iraqi Jew. They, like their fellow Iraqis, resented British interference in their country domestic and foreign politics and desired complete independence. Iraqi communist Sasson Dalal, who was the main leader of the party for a short while and was executed by the state, mentions that his joining the party was inspired by the desire to fight Anglo-American imperialism. In addition, it took the British long hours to come to the assistance of Jews during the Farhud. This fact had been known and also done much to stir anger against them. Upon joining the ICP, Jews worked together with Muslims and Christians, although work of Jews within the Jewish regions was also typical of communists like Michael. And the Communist Party emerged out of three splinter groups. One of them was more Jewish than the others, but even within the larger Communist Party, there are certain cells that are exclusively Jewish. But more commonly, the ICP was a non-sectarian organization par excellence. In its cells, unions, the ICP, and other ICP branches, Jews worked with fellow Muslims and Christians. Jews were drafted and drafted other people in colleges in the city of Baghdad and other places in Iraq. They hosted communist meetings in their home, and they offered refuge to communist demonstrators and people fleeing police violence. A very important position or a very important function of Jews in the party was translating materials from English, from French, and from other materials. And those were published in the Communist Journals Party, in the newspapers of the party, Al-Qaeda, Al-Sharara, Al-Asas, Al-Majalla, and others. And here, if we go over the list, we can see that Engels' Origins of the Family, Stalin's Historical Materialism, were translated by Jews. Naim Tweg translated part of the history of the Bolshevik Party and Das Kapital. Shimon Balas used to translate from Sessoir and literature written by Louis Aragon. So the involvement there was quite prominent. As Sami Michael recalled, we read everything: the Communist Manifesto, the press of the British and Soviet parties, the writings of Marx and Engels. We sat and learned English far more than what our school required in order to be communists. We learned not only to understand, but also to translate and explain in a way that things would be acceptable to the Iraqi mentality, which was never exposed to any written ideology, but to shallow anti-Semitic propaganda in the radio and the mosques. Now, Michael was also a part of a communist organization called the League for Combating Zionism, عصبة مكافحة الصهيونية, and it was assumed that many communists would join this organization. This organization was only legal for about 3 months in 1946, but it managed to draw the attention of a wide range of Iraqis. The idea of the League were lucidly outlined in Yusuf Harun Zilcha, that was the League's secretary, a Jewish man, in a book that he authored called Zionism, the Enemy of the Arabs and the Jews, As-Sahayuniya Aduwat al-Arab wal-Yahud. And if we want to think about a parallel to this organization, it would probably be the Bund in Eastern Europe. The basic idea behind this organization was that anti-Semitism is a product of this class struggle. Whenever there's a conflict between classes, Jews are used as convenient scapegoats, and so the Jews should join the workers in the class struggle. They should join the class struggle, and then anti-Semitism will decrease. Zionism to them was a colonialist and capitalist movement, and they argued, and I quote, that Jews do not have a shared history. The history of the Arab Jews, al-Yahud al-Arab, is different from the history of Russian Jews or British Jews. And they spoke about the fact that the Jews do not have a shared mentality, takwin nafsi, that manifests itself in a shared culture, because they lived for thousands of years in various communities and became part of the societies in which they lived. So the idea that Jews are part of the society in which they lived was quite dominant there. Now, on June 28, 1946, the League held their largest demonstration in Iraq that was very violent, and during which one of the Jewish communists, Naim Tweg, was killed. There are numerous articles in Arabic about this Jewish martyr, and later on Sami Michael himself would reflect on, the Shias and the other people in Baghdad that came to visit the family of the Jewish mourners. Now, there was during the years 41-45, there was some room for communist activities. However, especially after 1948, the state unleashed a brutal campaign against the Communist Party. This was done especially after a series of demonstrations called the Wathba, in which Jews, Muslims, Christians, other communities protested together against the state pro-British policies and social conservatism. That was followed by a wave of arrest, which was added to already a very neat network of espionage and surveillance. And in this context, Michael has to leave Iraq. He now finds himself in Israel. 1 year after he arrives, in the years 1950-1951, the majority of the Iraqi Jewish community arrives in Israel with no money because of legislation that froze their property, and they live in transit camps known as ma'abarot. As Eli mentioned, and others, Michael joined the Israeli Communist Party, at the time called Maki. Now, I should like to mention that joining the Communist Party was not an easy matter. Mapai, the governing laboring party, made it almost an impossible mission. It controlled most of the municipalities in whose proximity the transit camps were located, and its representative dominated the local directorship of each camp. Often, an immigrant who chose to be a communist was denied housing or employment. And so, while we find a lot of Iraqis joining the party, this was by no means an easy decision. Now, interestingly, the Iraqis used their experience in Iraq to explain the realities in Israel. In a pamphlet addressed to the people of the transit camp of Khulon, for example, Iraqi communists called on all the noble people to resist the state attempts at terror and starvation. The struggle of the newcomers, this is in Arabic, Nidal al-Ulim, for decent housing, water, work, health, and education should continue. I quote, we did not leave Iraqi terror to find it in Israel. We did not struggle against the enemies of the people in Iraq to bow our heads to them in Israel. In another journal called Sarkhat al-Ma'abarot, the cry of the transit camps, a communist by the name of Eliyahu Ezel wrote against service in the Gadna, in the Israeli paramilitary organization. This organization was compared to the Futuwa, the fascist youth organizations in Iraq. This article mocked the military spirit of the Gadna, again a very important phrase in Iraq of the 1930s. The comparisons to Iraq did not end there. Khirut, the right-wing party, was often compared to the Iraqi fascist party or proto-fascist party Al-Istiqlal. For example, in a story published in a journal called Sawt al-Ma'abarot, the voice of the Ma'abarot, the reporter talked about the visit of Muhammad Mahdi Quba to the transit camp. Now, Quba was an Iraqi uber-nationalist, ultra-nationalist, and the story opened in the following words. Muhammad Mahdi Quba, excuse me, Menachem Begin visits the transit camps in the service of American dollars. So the comparisons were drawn all the time. Now, Sami Michael himself participated in these events. In 1949, he published an article called "Who Persecutes Iraqi Jews?", which contended that the Iraqi regime, aided by the British, had attacked the Jews, yet the Jews and the Muslims worked together in Iraq. Michael paid special heed to the case of Shaul Tweg, which I've mentioned before, the Jewish communist and a member of the League, describing those who came to identify with the Jewish family who lost its son. And he wrote, "A final word to certain elements in Israel. As a Jew who lived for 22 years in Iraq, I saw that the oppressors of the Jews in Iraq were not the people. This is utterly impossible because the enemy of the very same people are the ones that oppress the Jews. I lived amongst and worked with and fought for the Iraqi people. I know them. Their sons are good and brave." Now, that position also put him to a very sympathetic position towards the Palestinians or towards the Arab citizens of Israel, who at the time lived under a very strict military rule. And Michael's stories in Al-Ittihad and also in Al-Jadid, both as a journalist and as a writer, cover both. On page 4 of Al-Ittihad and Kol Ha'am, you can find his stories from the transit camps. And those are heartbreaking because what he did is not only to describe the very difficult position of people who didn't have houses. He also described the lack of drinking water, child labor, the thugs, the biryonim that controlled the transit camps. And really these vivid stories gave you a sense of this state of utter dependency in which people who lived in the transit camps were dependent on the state, not only on getting a house in a neighborhood, in a shikun, but also moving from a tent to a wooden shack when it was raining, when they were dependent on food stamps, on milk for babies, mothers who lost their babies when they waited for ambulances who never showed up. So again, there's a whole panorama in his work as a journalist. But his work also covered, again, what it was like living under military rule in Israel. Later on, he would reflect on that. I was a journalist. I was a leader in the communist underground. So remember, the memory of the Iraqi past. All of a sudden, everything I knew was not only worthless because it was in Hebrew, but also because it belonged to the Arab enemy. When I spoke Arabic, they, the Israelis, thought I was an Arab. It was difficult to count how many times I was taken off a bus for security checks. They thought I left my village without a permit from the military government. I was called by my Iraqi name, Saleh, and obviously that didn't help. I was ashamed to tell them that I was Jewish. In Iraq, I fought and battled against any aspect of hostility towards the Jews. And here I am treated with hostility as an Arab. I remember my Arab friends in Iraq who identified with me and fought for me. I was very sorry that those who behaved like that towards me were Jewish. And at the end, they would always ask me, why didn't you tell us that your father's name is Menashe? Again, if you focus on what the communists are doing at the time, they celebrate the Iraqi Wathba. There are articles in Kol Am and Al-Ittihad, including by Emil Habibi, about questions relating to the freezing of the Jewish property in Iraq, about Fahd. And this is all their poems by Bahr al-Ulum, an Iraqi jailed poet that Sasson Somer translates into Hebrew. So the presence of Iraq is quite dominant. Again, to give an example, returning to the case of Kharut, there was a demonstration in 1951 in Tiberias where Iraqi Jews demanded to execute 2 Palestinians for every Jew executed in Iraq. And Emil Habibi at that point addresses the newcomers in Iraq, asking them not to lend a hand to such things. And this is what he writes. The newcomers from Iraq who heard about the demonstration organized by Kharut in Tiberias against the Arab citizens must remember clearly the racist demonstration that the fascist party in Iraq, the Independence Party, organizes now against the Jewish citizens of Iraq. They must have noticed the similarity between the names of the 2 fascist parties in Iraq and in Israel. Liberty, Kharut, here, and independence, Istiqlal there. Both share the same language, shared by fascists anywhere. Now, I just want to end by referencing the sketches that Michael wrote in Arabic and in Hebrew. Just to give you an example, here's a sketch that was published in Kol Am about Zuzu, the police dog. And this is what he writes. The value of the dogs has increased dramatically in recent times, and today it was even doubled. Much relies on their noses. Whenever a crime is committed in the proximity of an Arab village, the dogs arrive at the suspected territory. And they rule whether all the inhabitants should be banished and houses and shack destroyed, or whether the man alone should be exiled. So the dogs have acquired positions of international importance. They decide the fate of the refugees, women and men alike. And later on, Michael would reflect on the fact of how much he hated, these thugs entering, for example, the Arab section of Jaffa, that reminded him of the thugs that entered the Jewish neighborhoods during the Gailani days, or how much he resented the fact that people came to Arab homes and demanded to turn in sons and daughters that return illegally to Israel. So what you have in this party is, at least in one short moment, Jews writing about Arab affairs, Arab writing about Jewish affairs, and all with the hope of creating some sort of solidarity. Now, to conclude, I do not want to create a romantic impression of either Maki or the ICP. Although both parties attracted Jews, they had their own share of problems, and many. Within the Iraqi context, the inner divisions within the party, the betrayal of one of its leaders, Malik Saif, that was horrendous to the party, and his confessions, all of that were detrimental to the party. There were Stalinists, there was the whole issue of supporting partition, which we could talk about later. So this was not just a party of solidarity and happiness. In Israel, as Eli Reches noted, the party was, again, blind to the crimes of the Soviet Union. It was, as Eli noted, quite corrupt, something that Sami Michael commented on. And also, and it goes back to Ella's point, there are many complaints of Iraqi Jewish members who were members of the party, including those who continued, that they didn't know how to capitalize on the fact that the party reached some 20% of the votes in transit camps. There was never an Iraqi member of Knesset sent by the communists to the party. There was a dismissive approach towards the inner struggles that people like Sami Michael and others had, whether to write in Hebrew or in Arabic. It was very dogmatic. And that made Sami Michael leave the party in 1955 and take a different route. And you see this also after the riots in Wadi Salib, where the Communist Party publishes this very hysterical leaflet where they're saying the riots are not about race, they're not about ethnicity, they're about class. And so again, I didn't want to romanticize what was going on, but actually to point to this universe of people still speaking in Arabic in the transit camps, people creating these solidarities, which were quite significant. I think the two other comments are worthwhile when we reflect of the 1950s, when we think about contemporary Israeli politics. So first of all, in Israel today, the discourse about the Mizrahi past is largely informed by the realities in Israel today. So we talk about, the tendency of Mizrahis towards the right. But we forget when we talk about this that there's a large and significant component of Mizrahi leftist activities. And this is not just in Iraq. There are studies today about the participation of Jews in leftist parties and in Communist Party in Egypt, in Morocco, in Iran, in the Today, which Sami Michael also met when he was there briefly. And perhaps we can think about an alternative to thinking about these kind of very rigid categories that we have about right and left. Second, the richness of Sami Michael's cultural universe really makes a mockery of the divisions between East and West. Because if we consider his literary work, his cultural work in Iraq and in Israel, it's the work of, and Yigal mentioned this in his talk, it's an Arabic-speaking world. But it's also about Gorky and the Mother and Aragon and Zola and Dickens and Lenin and Marx. And there's a comment that Sami Michael makes how he translates the speeches of the leaders of the the Israeli Communist Party into Arabic, to Al-Ittihad, and how he senses the superficiality, because the background that he brings is much stronger than theirs. So just to end, I would like to finally reach one part of a tiny segment of Michael's literary work, and I want to leave you with a part that many in this room actually wrote about, which is Sami Michael's first novel, describing Abu Shaul, the protagonist's father, and how he responds to the attempts to spray him with the DDT upon his arrival to Israel. Before we knew what was happening, a white cloud of DDT enveloped Abu Shaul, a man both respected and influential within Baghdadi community. Through the cloud, we saw my father lift his hand towards the spray gun. It was a silent protest. Hair, mustache, and eyebrows turned white. The silk tie, the stretched shirt, and his elegant suit instantly changed into dusty rags. After that humiliating moment, and them treating him like a herd of animals, I saw my father silently trying to maintain his dignity by refusing to sneeze. Tears streamed from his nose, his face muscles contorted like a tormented mask. And everything seemed disfigured, ugly, and revolting. The spasm lasted only a few minutes, but my father had won. He hadn't sneezed. In a way, Sami Michael hasn't sneezed in front of many pressures and challenges, large and small. This was to his own benefit, but moreover to the benefit of Israeli society. Thank you very much.
I should add that when Yigal and I were working on planning the conference, we thought that an important contribution would be to invite graduate students, PhD candidates who conduct their work on Israeli literature in general, and particularly so on the work of Sami Michael. We had hoped even to arrange and organize a seminar for graduate students. That didn't work out for a variety of reasons, but at least we managed to get, if I'm not mistaken, 2 PhD candidates. Aviv Ben-Or is one of them. Aviv helped me out in formulating the basic concept of thankful. Aviv is a Schusterman scholar, a doctoral student in the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brenda University, as well as fellow at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brenda. He's studying modern Hebrew literature and the Jewish literary tradition in a broad sense, ranging from the medieval period to modern times. He's concentrating specifically on Jewish culture and histories in the Arabic-speaking region. Aviv's doctoral work explores the contact between Hebrew and Arabic literatures and cultures, as well as manifestations and expressions of Arab Jewish identity, and his research will be centered on Iraqi Jewish authors in Israel who produce writing in both languages. Today's presentation by Aviv is entitled A Utopian Impulse, Sami Michael's Arabic Fiction of the 1950s. Aviv, thank you.
So I have an opening quote, and I see that the Hebrew came out here, mishubeshet, but I didn't fix it because I thought that this was symbolic, perhaps, of the idea of Hebrew as a unified language when written by somebody like Sami Michael, who complicates that idea very much, coming from a different place and coming from a different language. So I'll try to read it here. נטישת שפה אינה דומה לגמילה מעישון, זה דומה לכריתת איבר חשוב מן הגוף, שתמיד ועד המוות יחסר לך. Abandoning a language is not like withdrawal from smoking. It is like having an important limb chopped off the body that will always, until death, be lacking. Michael refers here to the transition he made from writing in Arabic to writing in Hebrew. And that transition was by no means simple, nor was it a given, as can be seen from the violence in his characterization of the process. In the early 1950s, shortly after Michael had arrived to Israel from Baghdad, he was still writing in his native Arabic language, as we've heard about. During these years, he was intensely engaged with the burning social, political, and cultural questions that engulfed Arabs and Jews in Israel immediately following the creation of the state. My goal here is to stress the significance of the very fact that Michael was publishing in Arabic long before he would become known as an Israeli Hebrew author. And I maintain that reading his early Arabic writings is crucial to understanding his significance as a Hebrew writer, because it was here that his poetic project began to crystallize. The literary self that he would imagine in Hebrew later on was already taking shape in Arabic. While I will not discuss his Hebrew works today, I would like to suggest that we view all of his writing, both Arabic and Hebrew, as part of the same textual constellation. Sami Michael is known popularly in Israel as a Mizrahi writer. And as was said last night as well as today, he'd been marginalized for many years from the Hebrew canon, and only since the 1990s has figured increasingly into academic studies of Hebrew literature, usually in relation to what is referred to as Sifrut Mizrachit. I would like to stress that long before this, he published short stories and articles, as we heard, under the pen name Samir Marid, Samir the Rebel, in Al-Ittihad, the Communist Party's Arabic language newspaper, as well as Al-Jadid, which was the sort of cultural, literary supplement to Al-Ittihad. He penned 9 fictional stories during the first 4 years of Al-Jadid's existence, more than any other single writer, Arab or Jewish, during that time. And I suggest that these early Arabic texts are highly relevant not only for understanding Michael as a Hebrew author, but also because they reveal the intersection of ideology, aesthetics, and the multiplicity of languages below the surface of Israeli literature. In other words, the category Mizrahi writer reduces somewhat the complexities and thematic content of Michael's works. Nearly all of Michael's Arabic stories depict life in Israel for newly arrived immigrants from the Arab world, and they strive to give representation to the oppression of a working class at the hands of a corrupt government. As such, the subversive aspects of these stories and their opposition to the Zionist narrative of the 1950s can easily be identified. For example, his story, The Wall, As-Sawar, opens with the following line: "Everything in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, is holy, except for human life. While such a caustic tone characterizes many of Michael's stories, when viewed together as a group, these texts exhibit the early stages of an aesthetic project that was already charged with what George Lukács refers to as a realism whose extreme possibilities are somewhat paradoxically richer than actual life. The scenarios that Michael's short stories depict tend toward the extreme. Such rhetorical strategies would seem to correspond to the dire circumstances of the conditions that newly arrived Jewish immigrants from the Arab world faced in the 1950s in Israel. On the one hand, these stories contain subversive dimensions that undermine the Israeli national narrative and its symbols. On the other hand, they also reflect a utopian potential, one that often remains unrealized even within the space of the text. It remains more of a trace than an explicit expression. It is similar to what Frederick Jameson recently called the utopian impulse, where I've taken my title. The utopian impulse in realist representation that has yet to declare itself. There is no program for a new world order, but instead the beginning of an Arab-Jewish literary self that would seek new means of social representation. And we've heard some talk today about mention of the utopian and the universal in Michael's work, and I would like to stress that it's very much present in his early Arabic stories as well. Indeed, the extreme possibility of Arab-Jewish subjectivity emerges through the encounter between two languages, Arabic and Hebrew. It is the tension in the attempt to represent notions of Arabness and Jewishness as somehow compatible and not mutually exclusive. Oftentimes, the figure of the Arab Jew is not embodied by a specific character, but rather through content, themes, and signifiers emerges as possessing what Derrida calls the features of a strongly marked figure. This is reflected in the landscape and the setting of two of Michael's short stories, The Wall, Asawar, and This Is My Father, Hada Abi. In each of these stories, walls and borders serve symbolically as the backdrop upon which each text unfolds. The Wall tells the story of a poor family living in sight of the military barrier that marked the dividing line in Jerusalem between Israeli and what was at the time Jordanian territory, in between which lay the no man's land, Shatach Hefker. The Wall forces the narrative gaze to stare at the blind spot of Israeli and Arab national discourses, that physical space between Arab and Jew that belongs to no man, restricted and yet also desired by the text. Chana, the mother of the family, lives in fear of the wall that looms outside of her kitchen window, marking all life with death. I quote, "Even the innocent flowers that swayed in the green grass would bear the scent of death to Chana's nostrils, the scent of Arab and Jewish blood that had fallen upon those flowers." The wall is a spectral entity in the text, possessing a dark power in that it bluntly symbolizes the Arab-Israeli conflict. Chana's family lives under its gaze and beneath the muzzles of the rifles that jutted out like wicked black fingers under its surface. And yet, living physically on the border itself, it also emphasizes a subjectivity located on an interstice, in a liminal space. Quote, "Chana lived on the borders, and the borders were like a deep wound that was unable to heal." The wall hovers menacingly over the characters in the text, both threatening and reaffirming the divide between Arab and Jew. The narrative revolves around a single event. Chana's son, Ofer, disappears on the other side of the wall. In the end, an Arab soldier from the Jordanian side returns Ofer to his parents. Quote from the text, "An Arab, the enemy, was carrying her son." The text places the words enemy in quotation marks in order to undermine the notion that the Arab is truly the enemy of the Jew. The striking image of the weeping Jewish mother clinging to the Jordanian Arab soldier who has saved her son illuminates a potential reality, one in which Arabs and Jews become equals. Indeed, the text closes with Chana envisioning that the distance between her home across the valley to the wall has now diminished, and she imagines offering food to those soldiers standing behind it, now humanized for her, despite the lack of humanity she faces in the context of conflict. Though the text reflects socio-political realities in the construction of essential Arab and Jewish identities, it does so while expressing a utopian desire for something beyond this reality, beyond the wall, and beyond the limits of the putative no man's land between Arab and Jew. And yet, despite this, the Arab character only has a small space in the text and is only represented as an enemy soldier to be fed sustenance by the Jewish mother, also exposing a certain ambivalence in the ability of any text to bridge national and ethnic divides. Michael's story, This Is My Father, follows Shimon, a recent immigrant from an unnamed Arab country, through a day at work as a manual laborer in an orchard. Shimon's character is representative of the fragility of an Arab-Jewish subjectivity caught in the grips of a discourse that blindly equates Arab with enemy. The text highlights this tension when Shimon arrives to work in the field to learn that his group has been assigned an armed security guard to protect them. The orchard is located near the 1949 Green Line and is purportedly exposed to the threat of attacks from Arabs on the other side. The representation of the security guard mocks the Zionist image of the chalutz. He was of towering height and wearing tall leather shoes. This creature was eccentric and strange-looking from his wide riding pants to his wide leather belt that was embroidered with glistening white screws and his wide-brimmed hat. And the wrinkles in his face were deep, like the creases in a ball gown. The cigarette between his lips emitted a thin thread of smoke that twisted around his irritated eye. That twisted around his long nose and tickled the eyelashes of his left eye. It was obvious that the smoke irritated this eye, but this strange fellow did not remove the cigarette from between his lips. Instead, he closed the eye, and this gave his face an expression of arrogance and conceit. He carried the gun over his shoulder with the confidence of one who might say that his mother gave birth to him with this plaything in his hands. Moreover, this guard announces his willingness to shoot any Arab on sight. One bullet would suffice, he says. The guard's characterization turns the Zionist ideal of the chalutz into a brute thug through whom the figure of the Arab, already and subversively marked by the text as an essentialized other, becomes completely dehumanized. The climactic moment of the story recasts its psychological violence as physical, consequently dehumanizing the figure of the Jew as well. Shimon's father, who we have learned already is prone to walking alone in the fields at night, wanders into the orchard where Shimon works, and he is shot and killed by the guard, who mistakes him for an Arab. The old man calls out in Arabic to the guard, thinking that he himself had encountered an Arab, and the latter shoots him without hesitation, thinking the very same thing. In a scathingly ironic turn typical of many of Michael's early Arabic stories, the guard's knowledge of Arabic, the language of the enemy, leads him to kill a Jew. The story closes with Shimon's recognition of the corpse's identity, crying out, "Have Abi, this is my father." While the explicit message seems to suggest that blind fear and hatred only lead to self-destruction, the representation of extreme personalities and their dehumanizing effects express a sense of despair in the face of the social and political reality of the 1950s. This reality is traced through Shimon's internal conflict as he is pulled unnaturally towards seeing the enemy within his own self. The story confronts the seeming impossibility of constructing an Arab-Jewish literary self in a socio-politically hostile environment as it strives to represent the complex depth of individual experience confronted with the lived reality of dehumanization. If the wall attempts to deconstruct the dehumanization of the Arab enemy, This Is My Father despairs of the possibility to do so. Both texts contain a sense of promise and a desire for a future world not fully conceived, but located on the border between the political reality that polarized Arab and Jew and the potentiality for a reimagined national space where essentialized identities might be transcended, or at least where their limits might be exposed. While these two stories, The Wall and This Is My Father, openly treat the broader national conflict, other stories Michael published, such as The Black One, Al-Aswad, and The Artist on the Falafel, Al-Fanan wal-Falafel, focus more intensely on one individual character's conflict. The first story, Al-Aswad, tells of a young Moroccan immigrant on the brink of suicide. He's in Gana Zikaron in Haifa, the memorial park, where he writes of his intentions to kill himself in a letter to his father. He intends to become, quote, the master of his own fate, to achieve agency through taking his own life. The Black One fixates on the absurdity of the cruelness of the protagonist's world. It is not so much in the choice to live that the text offers its most potent symbolic expression, but rather in the idea of suicide as an act bound up with the act of writing. Because the focus of the text is the suicide letter itself. Suicide, consequently, becomes the means by which to construct the character represented in the text. The young man writes, "I have found here in Israel that the path of death is the only path open before me." Michael positions death at the center of the national narrative in Israel for his Arab Jewish character, a soldier who has just completed his service and is now out of work, literally on the street with no food. This recasts the notion of heroic death and sacrifice, tov lemut ba'ad artzenu, as self-dissolution in isolation, excluded from the collective story and recognition of such sacrifice. And yet this imagined death is also paradoxically the means by which to achieve agency in the story, to become master of one's own fate, suggesting a sense of potential beyond the exclusion and repression in the protagonist's social world. Michael's story, The Artist on the Falafel, is the story of a destitute street artist who is both deaf and mute. He cannot speak, but he practices his craft drawing on the sidewalks outside of a cinema in Haifa. He is driven by a need to create, despite being at the brink of starvation and hopelessness. The artist's character functions allegorically in relation to the possibility of being positioned as an Arab Jew in the Israeli society of the 1950s, raising the question as to the possibility of literary representation in the context of immigration, transition, and language loss. As the poor artist is gripped with the urge to kneel down over his work, he imagines drawing additional lines, slender lines that no chalk was capable of drawing. Here, the text subtly articulates an impulse for some other means of representation, some other way of writing, a desire to pass beyond the confines of social and political discourse. Perhaps more importantly, the artist is a meditation on the possibility of human agency in a reality fraught with seemingly insurmountable difficulties. Both of these stories imagine a subjectivity expressing potential on the verge of its own collapse. When given poetic form, this mode of representation carries with it a hope to bring about a change in that reality, something each story points to in providing endings that reflect not just Arabs and Jews overcoming their difference, but human beings uniting, a certain sense of a universal humanism that would follow in Michael's Hebrew novels later on, as we've heard about today, and I assume we will continue to hear about. I have offered here just a small sample of Sami Michael's Arabic stories, though I argue that they already constitute the establishment of an Arab-Jewish subjecthood that would become more fleshed out and multivalent in his Hebrew novels decades later. My intent here is not to determine whether Arab Jew as a social or political identity is viable, nor how it is bound up with Mizrahi discourse in Israel. Rather, I'm referring to how it finds poetic expression in the writings of a Jew who grew up in the Arab world, speaking and writing in the Arabic language, before then becoming Israeli and making the transition to Hebrew. For most of the characters in these short stories, the possibilities that they embody remain unfulfilled, mere utopian impulses. Yet it is in their very articulation, in thinking through or imagining them, that these stories gesture towards something almost ineffable, something on the horizon beyond national discourse and conflict. When we read Michael's Hebrew novels through the lens of his early Arabic stories, it becomes clear that they constituted the beginning of an important moment for Hebrew literature, one in which other possibilities and other modes of imagining the relationship between the construction of the national subject and the literary self began to take shape, both the Arab self, the Jewish self, and all that lies in between. Thank you.